I was never close to my grandmother Eulalia. I knew that people in Colonia regarded her with respect, but also with suspicion. They whispered about her, that she had gifts, that she helped people in ways that couldn't be explained. But to me she was just an old woman with a stern look and bony hands who rarely spoke to me. When she died I thought I wouldn't receive anything, but I was wrong. She left me her house. From the moment I walked through the door, the rusty key trembling in my fingers, I knew something wasn't right. The house was old, with a tall, thin structure that seemed to sag under its own weight. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and the air inside was damp and somewhat musty, like rotten wood mixed with burnt oil. As I took my first step inside, the floor creaked with debris falling from the collapsed roof in certain parts, as if the house itself were awakening with my presence. I murmured to give myself courage, resigned and thinking about how I would fix everything further, to convince myself that everything would be okay. The echo of my voice quickly died away in the heavy atmosphere of the house. I cautiously walked around the entire space, running my hands over the dusty furniture. There were shelves filled with jars of cloudy liquids and twisted roots, black candles sunk to the bottom, books without titles stacked in the corners, things I definitely didn't understand. I climbed the stairs cautiously, and in a way, I felt like an intruder when I reached the main room at the top of the house. It was my grandmother's. I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The window frames and doors had marks carved into the wood, strange symbols as if someone had written a warning in a lost symbol. I reached out to touch one and a shiver immediately ran through my body. It was a real physical sensation, as if something inside the house was reacting to my touch. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched by something invisible became more than evident, and I wanted to escape from there. It wasn't paranoia, and it wasn't my imagination. That feeling was real. When I turned around, I felt a change in the light, and a shadow moved just out of my field of vision. My breathing stopped, and I spoke, wondering in a trembling voice if anyone was there, but everything was silent. The hallway was completely empty, but I was sure there was something there. I knew because I could feel its presence and a pressure on my chest, as if the air had become less breathable. But that was the fear that permeated the house. I swallowed and hurried down the stairs, feeling that if I turned around at the wrong moment, I would see something I shouldn't have seen. I was so nervous and conceited, but I had to get out of there quickly. Although, on the other hand, I thought it was just my imagination tricking me, feeding off the eerie atmosphere of the house. When I got to the living room, I tried to calm down because it was just the weight of the house, the overwhelming silence. My mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw something that made me doubt everything. The marks on the walls weren't just on the door frames, they were also on the floor. Drawn in circles forming patterns that surrounded the entire house, it wasn't a strange decoration. They were some kind of seals to enclose something, and I was inside. I had no choice but to stay while I figured out what to do with that place. Grandma wasn't someone I had close contact with because of her habits and oddities, and now I could see how strange she was. As the days passed, the place became darker, though quiet, and it wasn't just the loneliness or the discomfort of being in a place that didn't feel like my own. There was something else, something breathing in the walls, something that crept into the dark corners when I wasn't looking, and the nights were worse. The silence was never absolute. Sometimes in the early morning, I heard creaks on the stairs, as if someone were climbing with slow, careful steps. Other times, they were murmurs close to where I was sleeping, too low to be understood, but clear enough to know they weren't in my head. Believe me, I began to doubt everything. I left the lights on so that they seemed off. When I woke up, I would close the doors and they would remain ajar. One morning, I woke up feeling a weight on my chest, as if something invisible were sitting on top of me. I couldn't move and could only stare at the darkest corner of the room, where I swore I saw a presence wrapped in the same darkness from which I had emerged. I couldn't go on like this. I should have escaped from that place, but when I tried to leave, something prevented me, a feeling that I had to stay there, and somehow I needed to. The neighbors weren't very helpful. At first, they looked at me with pity or caution, as if they already knew what was happening to me, as if they had expected it. But finally I found Donna Marita. The woman who owned the store on the corner was an old woman with white hair tied back in a braid and a compulsion to smoke that made her smell like tobacco all the time. When she greeted me and looked at my face with the intention of asking me a question, she told me bluntly that something was bothering me at Grandma's house. Honestly, I didn't know. What should I say? She sighed and looked at the empty street as if she expected someone to hear us and said, "Eulalia didn't just live there. She protected that house and all of us who lived nearby. Many years ago, a girl from here, a little girl who was the daughter of some cart drivers, was possessed. I saw Natalia, that was the little girl's name. At first, she was a normal girl until she wasn't anymore. No one knew how it started, but from one day to the next she wasn't the same. At first, small things would happen according to what her mother told me, because one day, she asked me about a remedy, as Natalia would wake up in the night and sit in her bed staring at the wall with her eyes wide open. Sometimes she would say things no one understood, words that didn't make sense, but spoken in a voice that wasn't her own. Then came the noises, banging on the walls, footsteps in the house when everyone was asleep, things falling or breaking for no apparent reason, and then the horrific, heart-rending screams, so loud they could be heard everywhere and made many of us wake up to see what was wrong. Thus, one night all the neighbors rushed to the family's house because Natalia's mother was calling for help. When we entered, we found her on the floor with her face covered in scratches and her arms marked like pits. Her father tried to hold the little girl, but she wouldn't move. Like someone her age, her body bent at horrible angles as if her bones were falling out, and her back arched as if something inside her was trying to break out. Her laughter wasn't hers, it was expressionless and as if she were dead. Inside, your grandmother was the first to understand what was happening. She knew instantly that what was inhabiting Natalia's body wasn't human, and when the girl spoke there was no doubt. Her voice wasn't the delicate and fragile voice she remembered, it was something deeper, something broken and echoing, something that shouldn't be in that evil world. She looked at all of us and told us to leave, that Natalia was gone, that he had taken her place. I don't know how she had the strength, but Lelia faced it, pushed her way through the others, and knelt beside the little girl, taking from her clothes a jar of black liquid and a handful of dried herbs while the parents wept and the neighbors crossed themselves. She did what no one else dared to do. She held her down and forced her to drink something, and Natalia screamed as if she were being burned from the inside out. The ground shook, and the air became dense, thick, as if a black fog were floating in the room, and then the thing came out of her. They say it was like seeing a black homo taking shape, twisting, changing size and shape. Trying to cling to something or someone, he didn't want to leave and couldn't leave, but your grandmother's audacity wouldn't let him. She used rituals and amulets, forced him to stay in the house where you live, and locked him inside. That's what cost him his life. She didn't die that night, but she was never the same again. Her body became weak and her hands trembled. Her skin withered too quickly. She looked sick, exhausted and drained. She faded away until one day her heart gave out. Natalia's parents didn't want to stay, they left. They were far away with the girl still delicate, and afterward no one knew what became of them, only that her spirit didn't follow it, and that's because I was still here in that house where you live, and I don't know why your grandmother left it to you. Something entered her, something bad. Eulalia managed to get it out, but she couldn't destroy it, she couldn't get rid of it, so she did the only thing she could. She locked it in the house. She could do everything she could. She kept it there her whole life. No one dared to get too close, but now she looked at me with concern. Now she's gone. I felt a chill on my back that had nothing to do with the wind. What happens if the seals break? It took Dona Marissa a moment to answer me. So, what's in there is going to come out. My stomach sank and I realized that the facts were those marks on the floor, on the door frames in the garden. I had seen them the first day and touched them. I had cleaned and moved things without knowing what they were, and now, every night, the murmurs were louder. When I returned home, I was more scared than at the beginning, and the idea of running away, leaving everything behind, became more urgent. I knew there were things that shouldn't be known, stories that should remain in the dark, in the forgotten corners of memory, but now that story belonged to me, handed to me with the shopkeeper's stories and with all those people who looked at me with pity, out of the corner of their eyes, hoping something would happen to me. I thought about the little girl in that case and how her grandmother had helped her. That first night after learning the truth was perhaps one of the worst. Everything felt more anxious and scary, everything felt uncertain, and fears that made my stomach churn. What I could hear were no longer simple night noises. They were slow, careful footsteps, as if something was approaching and didn't want to be seen. I looked at the door of the room where I was staying, hoping to see something emerge. Overwhelmed by this, I couldn't sleep. It was probably early in the morning when I got up to make coffee and wait for morning to leave and leave everything behind, but I was heating the water when I heard someone walking on the roof, but not outside but inside. I know it's crazy to think about it, but I couldn't move and I couldn't breathe properly. I could only stare at the darkest corner, the eroded walls, where something black seemed most present. And suddenly, when I was able to drink something, I felt a chill run through me from head to toe as I sensed someone was there. When I turned around, all my fears fueled by the stories became real. Behind me stood a tall, shapeless figure with eyes that weren't there, but I felt them fixed on me. Panic choked my throat as I gasped for air. It was cold and icy. When I was finally able to move, I turned on the light with trembling hands, and the shadow disappeared, but the feeling that something was still there stayed with me. I couldn't stay there, not when I knew what was happening, but at that precise moment the knocking on the door alerted me. I peeked inside as if expecting to see something horrible, but to my surprise, it was Donna Marita. She was accompanied by another equally elderly woman. When she entered, she introduced herself. She was a friend of my grandmother's, and both of them had sealed away what they had released from Natalia with seals and magic. They knew what had happened and they knew it was stalking me. I couldn't stay in the house because the entity inside would consume my energy and my life. My grandmother had left me her house to continue as its guardian, but since I didn't have her skills or knowledge, it would be best to leave and close it forever. The woman promised me she could fix it, that she could reinforce the facts, lock it back into the thing she had released, but there was something in her smile that didn't inspire confidence, and she was right. I hadn't been able to doubt because she didn't come to seal it, she came to release it completely. I didn't know at what point everything got out of control. When it all began, things got worse and she seemed to be shaking with such horrendous energy that it coursed through everything. The lights flickered, and the only thing that seemed to move was beneath my feet. Something was unleashed in the air, a powerful energy. That woman dwelled on words and said things I didn't understand. But Donna Marita told me to have confidence. And suddenly I saw her smile. It wasn't a human smile, it was something more. The shadow emerged from the walls and came out of every dark corner as if it had always been waiting for its moment. It had no definite shape, but I think it was hungry. It moved within human speed and the woman froze. Her mouth opened in a scream, but she didn't have time to finish it. That thing simply took her. Her body, arching, shook. Something inside her made her creak, something snapped in an impossibly sharp way and her bones twisted. The thing consumed her and tore at her and used her like a shell until nothing remained but a trembling woman on the floor, her eyes white and her skin more wrinkled than I remembered. I stood in the living room trembling. The air smelled of ash and damp, as if something ancient had rotted inside the walls. There was no trace left of the whirlwind of shadows that had devoured the woman, only her inert body on the floor, bent impossibly, as if all her bones had broken at once. And then she moved. First a spasm, her fingers as if her nerves were activating one by one. Then her head turned with a dull click and her opaque eyes stared into nothingness, her gaze slowly opening and a breathy cry escaped her lips. She wasn't dead, or at least what was inside her wasn't. With slow, almost unnatural movements she sat up. His limbs stretched as if his body were a suit too big for the thing that now occupied it. His neck twisted to one side and his jaw appeared unhinged for an instant before it snapped back into place, and then, without looking at me, without making a single sound, he walked to the door. Out came the night gliding with a calm that made no sense. The wind at her side accompanied her, enveloping her. It left me rooted to the ground, unable to react. I didn't know how long I was motionless. Only when I felt Donna Marita's presence at my side was I able to react. Not only had we freed the house, that woman had been possessed. Donna Marita told me in a deep voice, with that tone used by people who have lived too long and seen more than they would like. That woman wasn't just a witch, she was a vessel, a body made to hold back what shouldn't be there. Free. Some are born with gifts to heal, others to see beyond the veil, and others, like her, with the cursed gift of being matter for wandering spirits, for shadows seeking hosts. It was an empty well where presences could enter but never leave. That meant the foul spirit was no longer free. Now it had a body, and someday somewhere I would free it. I couldn't stay any longer. I understood without anyone telling me. The house was empty but not clean. The walls were still impregnated with something muddy, something old and hungry. Although the demon was no longer trapped within its walls, the things it left behind, the energies that remained, the foundations would make this place uninhabitable. As I walked down the street, I felt something watching me. In the distance, I said goodbye to Donna Marita and told her to take care of the house. Eventually, I returned and everything was in ruins. The women who had helped me had died, like most of the older people who lived in the neighborhood, and all I saw was the rubble of Grandma's supposed prison, wondering if that thing still lived there or perhaps the lady had freed it when she died. I didn't know, but I also knew what I suffered and I wouldn't wish it on anyone else.